Okay, back in Daniel 11, not Daniel 10, and we had been discussing Cyrus the Great as history records him, and seeing how, as we look back, let me go back a couple of slides here, to Cyrus. We were in 539 BC when Cyrus allows the Jews to return to rebuild the temple, and of course the nation is under Medo-Persian authority at this time. And we discussed that. We read in chapter 11 of Daniel, verse 2, "Now will I show thee the truth? Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, shall he stir up all against the realm of Gracia." So we talked about those 3 particular kings, and we believe those kings to be Media, to be Lydia, and to be Babylon, and those corresponding to the 3 ribs that are in the mouth of the bear of the Medo-Persian Empire. And we talked through some of that. So we walked through Cyrus the Great already. We talked about how Isaiah wrote in 760, 700, somewhere between his ministry time, BC, about these events. And of course, here we are several hundred years later, and we find them coming to pass. That brings us then, as you see here, to Darius the Great. 522 BC, Darius the Great takes the throne. So we skipped kind of in 530, we see Cambyses take the throne. 522, Smerdis takes the throne, and then 522 as well, Smerdis does not last long, we find Darius the Great takes the throne. And we see him spoken of in Ezra 4, verse 5, and then again in verse 24. Darius the Great ascended to the throne in 522 BC. 519, he reauthorized the building of the temple in Jerusalem, reauthorized it to be built and to be completed. The reason why a reauthorization had to take place, if you recall from Ezra and from the histories, is because as they started to build, there were all of these very negative reports that the Samaritans, they weren't called the Samaritans yet, but men like Sanballat and Tobiah were sending back saying, these people are wanting to build Jerusalem specifically so that they can overthrow you, and specifically so that they can rebel. And if you recall, they encouraged the king. They said, look back in the history, the Jewish people have always been a rebellious people. And he looked back in the history, and he said that's true, so he stopped the building, and then it was not until a little bit later that building was reauthorized. Darius the Great is also known as being the king who waged a war against Gracia, against a contingency of the Greek. At this time, certainly was not an empire. It was just the nation of Greece who were rebelling, who were revolting. At this time, the Medo-Persian Empire had unchallenged control over the world. Everyone in the known world was, as far as the East and that region was concerned, was under their power. And so we see that Greece is now starting to become powerful. Greece is now starting to assert some level of desire for independence. At this time, of course, we can trace Greek thought. We know that really Alexander the Great is not just the height of their empire as it would relate to their strength, but it's also the height scholastically of their thought. And as you think of Socrates and Plato and the concepts of a republic and of democracy and the going back and forth, the debates, the Socratic method, all of these things that are being developed and thought through, concepts of freedom, the idea of the nation state giving way to something more centralized, all of these different ideas, being ruled by the people rather than just having a central authority. And so we begin to see the Grecians really starting to come onto the scene. Darius the Great would wage war against them in any number of different pockets. He would eventually be defeated soundly. This did not end by any means the Medo-Persian Empire or anything of the sort, but as far as his campaigns were concerned, 490 BC, we see him quite soundly defeated as he would go into Grecia, and Grecia would, to an extent, have some measure of success and thus be able to do their own thing, where they were able to develop in a measure of peace. Darius the Great died in 486 BC. We continue to trace history, and as we read through this in verse 2, by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Gracia. And this brings us to Xerxes. 36 years after Darius the Great takes the throne, we see Xerxes the First take the throne after Darius the Great dies. Xerxes the First is known in our Bibles as Ahasuerus. Now, what is the connection between, who is Ahasuerus in the Bible? Where do we find Ahasuerus?
Isn't he supposed to be like one of the tables that was supposed to be killed by Saul?
No.
It was his lineage or something?
You are thinking about in the days of Esther, and that's where your connection comes in, because this is the king of Esther. So it would be Haman that you were thinking about, Haman the Agagite, and Agag was a king that Saul was supposed to kill, and then Samuel kills him, and then the next time that we see anything having to do with Agag is in Esther, which is some 1,200 years later? I don't know. And Esther, Haman is called an Agagite. And so the question then becomes, did they call him an Agagite because Agag was one of those, he was the king of the Amalekites, and so he was elevated in Jewish history as kind of the great Jewish enemy of that day, and then Haman gets elevated after that point in Jewish history as the great evil of that day. And so the question is, did the Jews just call him an Agagite, or Jewish tradition actually states that Haman was a descendant of Agag, and that it was Saul's sin in allowing Agag to live until, of course, Samuel chopped him into little pieces, but allowing the people to live for a portion of time that allowed someone of Agag's lineage to get into Persia. We don't really know. But yeah, the connection that formed in your mind, though not complete, was Ahasuerus was the king in Esther's day. So very good. Now, Xerxes the First, Ahasuerus, he takes the throne, and we see this being most likely the king at the end of Daniel 11, verse 2, the one who would stir up all against the realm of Gracia. So remember, when we see Ahasuerus at the very beginning of the book of Esther, what's going on there? What is Ahasuerus engaged in that brings Esther into play? Do you recall what the event was that caused Vashti to be put down as queen, and then to have Ahasuerus look for a new wife?
It was some kind of a celebration in the summer that she would come.
Right, so there was a celebration. Sarah?
100 days or so?
More than that. 180 days. He had a 180-day feast. How many days are there in a year? 365, 360, right? And so a half a year feast, 6-month feast. And he did this, and it was a celebration of sorts, but it was more than just a celebration. In fact, this 180-day feast was where he was planning a massive attack to put down Greece. This was going to be his glorious campaign, and he had this 180-day feast to glorify himself, to elevate his own power, his own might, his own majesty, his own everything, right? And then simultaneously, that would be where he pulled together all of the nation, all of its leaders, to then conspire toward this great war against Greece. Of course, during the 180 days, Vashti, the queen, refuses to come and make a display of herself before them, and so she has thus dishonored the king, and so she is no longer allowed to be queen. She is put down and just put into his harem, and he chooses a new wife, and that new wife happens to be a woman named Hadassah. She does not go by the name Hadassah, however, because she does not want anyone to know she is a Jew. Her uncle Mordecai is the one who requested this, that she would not reflect the fact that she was a Jew, so she changes her name to something more Persian, namely Esther. And then she is chosen. Haman wants to kill the Jews because Mordecai won't bow down, and then you know the story. That's all Ahasuerus. That 180-day feast was a part of his plan to attack Greece. It was a part of, verse 2, stirring up all against the realm of Grecia. He stirred up the entire region against the realm of Grecia at that time. That was what those 180 days were about. Imagine a 6-month feast, and you might get the idea of just how much nationalistic fervor a man could well up, and a reflection of his power and such. So he wages this war. It was initially successful, but it fails to fully conquer them. Greece was well entrenched. Their warriors were very good at what they did. And because they were individual nation states, but they would band together at various times and such, they were very difficult to conquer. This, however, did unite Greece. Individual nation states were united really in their effort of hatred for the Medo-Persian Empire, and really awakened a sense of national fervor in Greece that had not been there before. Yes, sir?
Is this when the Spartans resisted the 300 and all that?
Yep.
Against Xerxes?
Yep. That would be against Xerxes and the Spartans. So the 300 Spartans against all of Xerxes' army, and that was that great war. Yep. And eventually all the Spartans were destroyed, but they held off for a very long time, allowed for reinforcements, allowed for people to flee, and became very mythical in many ways. All of that happened here. I hope you're seeing just how strongly rooted the Word of God is in history. These things are happening in history. You read a history book, you're reading this stuff. Xerxes is there, his armies are fighting the Spartans. Esther is there in Shushan, the palace. That's, this is happening within the Bible. And it also does remind you very carefully what the Bible is about. The Bible doesn't care about any of that because the Bible is tracing something very different, right? The Jewish people unto Jesus Christ. There's a line that the Bible traces, and it only traces other history as it weaves in and out of God's history. Right? Very good. So Xerxes wages this unsuccessful campaign against Greece. In 464 BC, Artaxerxes becomes the king of Persia. Does the name Artaxerxes ring a bell?
Is he grandson?
He's the son of Xerxes.
And isn't he very brutal?
He would be, well, not biblically. As far as where the Bible comes in, no. Where does he come in biblically? Yep. Yeah. Artaxerxes is the king of Nehemiah. And so Jerusalem, the temple is built, and now we have, of course, so Cyrus allows the Jews to return, right? To rebuild. Zerubbabel, Ezra, they go back then, and they begin this process. Ezra a little bit later, Zerubbabel first, Ezra a little bit later. And then we have Xerxes doing his thing, and then we have Artaxerxes, and the temple is rebuilt, but the walls of Jerusalem aren't getting up, right? They keep getting torn down by the Samaritans in the area, Sanballat, Tobiah, whatnot. And Artaxerxes becomes the king. Nehemiah is his cupbearer. And I say see page 1 of the timeline. So for those of you that have that timeline, we're technically on this next page. But on page 1, Artaxerxes is the one who decreed Jerusalem to be rebuilt. And that would be in 458. So 458 is right around that time that we believe the 70th week, the 70 weeks of Daniel begins. Because he's the one that actually called for Jerusalem, not the temple, that would be Cyrus in 539, but Artaxerxes is the one who said Jerusalem is to be rebuilt and gives that letter to Nehemiah to have it rebuilt and such. Within this time, this 145 years here, we find the ministry of Ezra, of Nehemiah, of Haggai, of Zechariah, of Malachi. And so the prophets are over in Jerusalem. They are prophesying. Esther is likely, she most likely outlives her husband, as he would have been probably a lot older than her. So she probably lives to see Jerusalem rebuilt, though never there. She's probably still in Shushan as the mother and grandmother of the king and such. Of course, in those days of Artaxerxes, we see Haman and all of the terrible things in the days of Esther surrounding Haman. There's a great deliverance of the Jews in that day, and a new feast begins called the Feast of Purim, or the Feast of Lots, right? And they still keep that to this day, though it is not one of their primary feasts. So all of that brings us into Daniel 11, verse 3. So there's a lot of history between verse 2 and verse 3, right? So we are skipping stuff. Not all the history is here, but thus far we're still filling in all these gaps with Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, right? And so all of these gaps are filled in. We then get to Alexander. And in Daniel chapter 11, verse 3, the Bible says, "And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." Verse 4, "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those." So we get a prophecy here of a mighty king. And notice it's at the very tail end of this idea of stirring up all against the realm of Gracia. So Artaxerxes does this, he stirs everyone up, Xerxes does this, he stirs everyone up against Gracia. He fails to wipe them out. Artaxerxes is not so much of a conquering king. He's not out there quite as much. Greece is able to, over the next 200 years or so, really gain in strength until the time of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is a very unique figure in history. Young, started his conquest around 30 years old, and just tore through the world. Greece had been allowed to incubate, to grow in strength, to develop their military, to develop tactics. And Alexander the Great particularly did something very unique in that he was not very interested in a navy. He wanted to defeat by foot, but with foot soldiers, the Persians, rather than what Greece had typically done was build a big navy and then go and kind of bombard land and then invade from the sea. And he chose rather to forego a large navy and just to invest all of his capital into foot soldiers and into the elements of modern warfare as it would relate to machines of war. The catapult was coming in this day. We would see the catapult play a very important role in the destruction of Tyre under Alexander the Great. And so he had his, as it were, scientists and philosophers building machines of war for the land rather than for the sea. And Persia had a great navy. And of course they had a good number of foot soldiers as well. But Alexander wanted to effectively cut off a part of their strength by not worrying about the sea initially. And then instead of taking the sea and fighting on the seas, he actually followed the coast and destroyed all of the port cities. So that the Navy lost areas where it could land. And thus, by destroying the ports, it effectively makes the Navy of none effect because they have nowhere to land, right? And so he's trying to destroy the Navy without having to confront the Navy. The guy was a genius. And so he meets Persia and defeats them. Persia runs back toward Shushan and Babylon and whatnot, and Alexander chooses not to follow them. Persia probably thought, we'll fall back, he'll follow us, our reinforcements will come, and then we'll overwhelm them again. Didn't work that way. Alexander just let them run, and he continued down the coastline. And, I'm getting ahead of myself here. There we go. Just to remind you here, Nehemiah was the cupbearer of Artaxerxes and was commissioned to build the wall. We talked about that. I just didn't hit the slide. So Alexander, he arose to power in 336 BC, and he conquered the whole of the Middle East and Africa by 326 BC. So about a 10-year span, and he was able to go all the way down to Egypt, and that was his goal. He starts in Greece, he kind of follows the coastline all the way down to Egypt, and then from that position of power, he now has the entire Mediterranean, right? He can reinforce by sea, he can reinforce by land. Cutting off his supply lines would be extremely difficult at that point, and then he can start to flood east from there, and that would be his goal. His conquest is not just seen here in Daniel 11, verse 3, but it's also seen in part, at least in the prophecy of Tyre in Ezekiel 26. In Ezekiel 26, we see a prophecy of Tyre being absolutely destroyed. And many people believe that this prophecy was fulfilled when Babylon did that many years prior. So in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar attacked Tyre. And Tyre was made up at the time of two distinct portions. There was a portion right on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. And then there was about a 1,000-foot tract of water, and then there was a large island. And they were connected with, it's kind of like a land bridge. It was fairly shallow, maybe 10 to 15 feet deep water that goes all the way across to the island. But Nebuchadnezzar absolutely destroyed Tyre, the city on the mainland, and they all fled to the island. And the island he sought to overthrow, I think, for something like 14 years. For something like 14 years, he besieged Tyre, and then eventually they kind of just made an agreement. We're gonna regard you, you're going to leave us alone, and Tyre was allowed to continue. This made Tyre very, very powerful. They had a wonderful natural port there. They were, even going back as far as we can find in the prophets of mentioning them, they were a very powerful port city, very rich, very lavish, so much so that in Ezekiel we see within that prophecy, the leader of Tyre was called the Prince of Tyre, right? And then the king of Tyre, in our interpretive system, is actually Satan. And Satan is described as being beautiful and great, and that's the description of Satan, of Lucifer, in Ezekiel, and it's connected to the idea of the king of Tyre, right? And this great, lavish, powerful nation and wealthy nation. So Alexander's conquering the coast, and he comes to Tyre. And if we take Ezekiel 26 literally, Babylon could not have been the fullest fulfillment of that because it wasn't destroyed. Then we come to Alexander. And what Alexander would regularly do is he would go into a city, and if they were willing to get on his side, he would not fully destroy them. So he goes to Tyre, and he asks them, may I please worship your God in your temple? And they said, well, you can worship at the temple on the mainland, which was effectively just a refugee camp at that point, but you can't come over to the island, because what's he going to do, right? He's going to get in a boat, he's going to come over to the island, and now that he's there, he's going to say, well, either you all do it my way or you're toast. So they said no, and after withstanding the great Nebuchadnezzar war machine for better than a decade, they were pretty confident. So they say, no, you may not, and he gives them one more chance. He says, I want, you're going to do things my way. They say no, and he says, well, then you're in a lot of trouble. He doesn't have a navy, though. And Tyre is a Persian city, and would be probably the greatest stronghold of the Persian navy. So Alexander, he goes to the city on the mainland, and he just decimates it. And he takes the rubble from that city, and his men begin building a land bridge, putting the rubble into the sea and building a bridge across the sea. And it's taking months and months, and a bunch of his guys are dying. They've got men on the wall. Tyre has men on the wall that are shooting down, and there are ships that are coming out and seeking to destroy the machines of war and kill the people who are building this. But eventually, he gets across, he gets his catapults within range, they begin to bombard the city, and they actually end up not getting through that main wall with that land bridge. They actually end up busting a hole in the wall on the southern end with a ship. They actually turned it into a battering ram and rammed through the wall on the southern end, and then they were able to overflow the city, where anyone that they did not kill, they sold into slavery. So he was very, very hard on that city, and it was absolutely decimated. This was unusual for Alexander. It was unusual for him to utterly decimate a city, but he got so angry at Tyre's response. And he couldn't just let it go, because then the Persian military would have that foothold in the land, that he absolutely decimated them, fulfilling the prophecy of Ezekiel 26 finally. And so we do see Alexander there as well. Questions or thoughts on this thus far? Anything that's come to mind? Okay, so he ends up going down to Egypt, and then after that he begins an Indian campaign, but he was unsuccessful. His men actually said, no, we don't want to fight anymore. They were getting tired. They'd been away from home a long, long time. And so they begin heading back. And as they head back, they head another way, a different way, so that they can conquer more. But they end up heading back. He ends up dying in 323 at age of 32 in Babylon. And he dies suddenly and of unknown causes, perhaps of poison. Nobody really knows how he died. But what do we see in Daniel? Verse 3 says, "And a mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with a great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken." There's this very strange idea here that a king will come and then he will be broken in the height of his strength, right? And that's what we find here. He stands up, he's in the height of his strength, and he suddenly dies, unknown causes. Now, there's an interesting element of Jewish tradition found here. And this is written by Josephus. Josephus was a historian, and he wrote from a unapologetically Jewish perspective. He was not a believer, he was a Jew, and he wrote well after the Bible, the New Testament was written. But he often, in his history, can give a very Jewish perspective to things, and he adds a lot of Jewish tradition. And according to Jewish tradition, there was an intersection between Alexander the Great and Jerusalem. And within this Jewish tradition, the high priest at the time, we'll talk more about him later, was a guy named Jaddua. And he had a dream, and within this dream, God told him to welcome Alexander the Great with great honor, to welcome him and to honor him. And then Alexander, according to this tradition, arrives, and as he arrives, he doesn't arrive to soldiers, he arrives to all of these priests. And the priests, of course, wore white robes. And so he sees all of these priests in their white robes. And he says that he saw Jaddua in a dream, that he had a dream where he saw men in white robes. And he feels as though this is a confirmation, of course, for him that the gods were speaking to him. And Jaddua, of course, crediting the Lord with having given him this dream. And according to Jewish tradition, the Jews actually showed him Daniel 11 verse 3 and showed him his role, showed him that he would have this great power and that he would conquer and that he would do according to his will, but then he would be broken. And so we see this idea that within Jewish tradition, he completely passed by the city of Jerusalem because he honored that city for having these men that were in his dream, and then them showing him effectively his fate and recognizing what would come to pass. Also from this Jewish tradition, Josephus tells us that Jadua's brother was named Manasseh, and he had married Sanballat, the Samaritan's daughter. Now, Sanballat is not necessarily a name, it's a title. Like Pharaoh or Cleopatra, they're titles, right? So you say, well, Sanballat, that was like 250 years ago. Okay, well, there's a lot of Sanballats because it's a title, right? So Sanballat would have been the leader of this Samaritan people, and tradition says that Jadua's brother married the Samaritan, Sanballat's daughter, and because of that, he was cast out of the priesthood. And we see some of this in Nehemiah 13, and this is where Nehemiah comes back and starts plucking beard hairs like we talked about several times. Sanballat then promises him a priesthood among the Samaritans. And Alexander actually, according to Jewish tradition, helped the Samaritans build their own temple in Mount Gerizim. And Mount Gerizim is where the Samaritan woman is when she says that we worship here in Mount Gerizim, but you say we need to worship down in Jerusalem. We'll see that come up again much later in the history. But the tradition states that it was actually Alexander that helped the Samaritans establish their worship system in a deeper way at Mount Gerizim through helping them build a temple in that time. Well, that brings us to Alexander suddenly dying. June of 323 BC. He suddenly dies, and his kingdom is broken up between his 4 generals. History at this point is becoming very, very, this history is very solid. We know this very well from history. He dies, his kingdom does not go to his son or his cousin or his uncles. It goes to these 4 generals, and these 4 generals break up his kingdom, and they each take a region. We read Daniel 11, verse 4. When he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. This has got to be Alexander the Great, right? It's got to be his 4 generals. This is the Bible telling us hundreds of years before what is going to happen. So he suddenly dies, and he gives this kingdom is given to his 4 generals. Cassander was one of his generals, and Cassander got the area of Macedonia. Lysimachus got Thracia, Seleucus got Asia Minor, and Ptolemy got Egypt. So I give you a little chart here. It's going away. Let's try this again. No, don't go away. Stay here. We want to see you. Let me take off the animation which is on there for some reason. If I can do that just briefly. It looked like there was another one anyway, so maybe we could have gotten away with that one, but let's see. Let's see if that worked. No. Okay, let's try this one. Is this one going to go away? Oh, this one. Here we go. It comes. Oh, okay. Yes. So we're zooming in. No, but I don't want to zoom in. Come on now.
Should have gotten a Mac.
Don't even start with me.
Pause and technical.
Please stand by. We're experiencing.
Actually, more or less what this is I built it in PowerPoint. Now I'm trying to use LibreOffice. Oh well. Let's, oops, that's not what I wanted to do either. Okay. Well, let's zoom in then. So, zooming in, we have up here, so we have the Mesopotamian Valley, and this would have been Seleucus. And then we have Egypt, and this would have been Ptolemy. And then we have Cassander and Lysimachus. This would be Lysimachus. Cassander got Greece proper, right? And then Lysimachus was here. So this would be the general layout. And again, I apologize. This is not in English. This is the best map I could find. It's actually in German. But this is what we see. So the two that we are going to break down and trace here now, like I show here, Cassander, Macedonia, Lysimachus, Thracia, they don't really matter scripturally, so we're going to leave them behind. The four kings that received this kingdom, of them there's only going to be two that we're going to trace. One is called the king of the north, the other is called the king of the south. And the king of the north is going to be Syria, and the empire is going to be called the Seleucid Empire. And then the king of the north is going to be Ptolemy, and the Ptolemaic line of pharaohs, the Ptolemaic Empire, and that would be Pharaoh. So in the north, we're going to have various titles. The primary title that we're going to be looking at is the title Antiochus. And in the south, of course, the primary titles we're going to be looking at are Pharaoh and Cleopatra. Cleopatra being a title, not a name, and Pharaoh being a title, not a name. Now, as we go through this is a very important thing to understand. Whether we're talking about Thracia, Macedonia, Syria, or Egypt, Pharaohs fighting Syrian kings, they're all Greek. Okay? These are all Greek. The Greek generals now live in these areas. Greek culture now resides in these areas, right? So they're all worshiping Zeus. They all have the mythology. They all have the learning. This is why Alexandria becomes the great seat of learning. Well, how did it end up in Egypt? Well, because Egypt was Greek. It was all Greek, right? Alexandria was a place of great learning, and it was a place of Greek learning. When we talk about pharaohs, you can be thinking about pharaohs, but he's not Egyptian. He's Greek. Cleopatra, we can talk about Cleopatra. She's not Egyptian. She's Greek. The Syrians, we can talk about. Now, the people are Syrian. The people are Egyptian, right, that live there. But they're now under a Greek empire. And all of these people came from these generals, and these generals were all rooted in Greece. Okay? So at this point, the entire known world, and certainly the world as the Bible considers it, is a Greek world. This is where the language of Greece begins to permeate the entirety of everything, right? In Babylon now, they're reading and writing in Greek. In Alexandria, in Egypt, they're reading and writing in Greek. In Syria, they're reading and writing in Greek. In Macedonia, they're reading and writing in Greek. Greek is everywhere. And that's not going to go away even when Rome takes over, which is why our Bibles aren't written in Latin. Our Bibles are written in Greek, because Greek was the language of the people. That's why. Because of Alexander. Alexander the Great started something that will continue well into our New Testament, in that the New Testament is written in Greek. And as Jesus quotes even the Old Testament, if you go and you read a lot of Jesus' quotes, Jesus actually doesn't quote the Hebrew Old Testament as much as he quotes the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. And it's very interesting. And Paul will do this too. He will quote the Greek Old Testament rather than the Hebrew Old Testament, because it's the one that the people knew, it's the one that the people read. So beginning in verse 5 of Daniel 11, we're now splitting up, and we're just focusing in on this region. Syria to the north, Egypt to the south, two Greek kings battling it out, and right in the center of this whole thing, in the only place to get from Egypt to Syria and Syria to Egypt, is this poor city called Jerusalem. They are in the center of the crossfire. It's like you've got Egypt down there, Syria right there. They both want to conquer each other. They both hate each other. And Jerusalem's just this poor city stuck in the middle of it. And they're going to just be fighting back and forth across that little tract of land over and over. See, because Egypt certainly doesn't want to let Syria get down here. And Syria certainly doesn't want to let Egypt get right there. So all of the battling is going to happen right here. Right? Right in the middle. Right where Jerusalem is. So, we continue then on our chart. And we begin in 323. That's when Alexander suddenly dies. His kingdom is broken up, as we see there at the bottom. And then we move up here to Ptolemy. And we have Ptolemy Soter. And of course, these Ptolemies are coming from Ptolemy, who was the general that took over. And, wrong page here. Ptolemy Soter, he's made a satrap in Egypt in 323 BC, and then he becomes the king or the pharaoh of Egypt. In 304 BC, Seleucus, right, who was one of those generals, the former prince under Soter, becomes king of Syria in the north. Now look at verse 5. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. So we have Soter in the south, and we have Seleucus becoming, who was under Soter, becoming the king of the north. So one of his princes was strong above him and have dominion. Literally above him. He's in the north now, as he becomes the king of Syria in the north. And that brings us to some of this history. So Ptolemy Soter, he's welcomed into Jerusalem. When all of this happens, so Ptolemy, remember, that's Egypt. He's welcomed into Jerusalem as a friend. But when he effectively becomes ruler over Jerusalem, he rules in a very cruel manner. He's a very, very cruel man to Jerusalem, to the Jews. He took as many as 120,000 Jews and Samaritans captive and brought them down to Egypt to work as slaves. Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, he was a successor to Soter, and he released these Jews. So he was much kinder to the Jews, and he released them, he let them go back home. But we're beginning to see, so initially Egypt has control over the area, right? Initially Egypt has control over over Jerusalem, over Israel, and Ptolemy Soter, and then Ptolemy Philadelphus. Ptolemy II Philadelphus requests at that time, because he's been kind to the Jews, right? He is the one that requests, he goes to the high priest and he says, would you please commission 6 elders out of all of the tribes of Israel and send them to Egypt? I want an accurate translation of your Hebrew Bible into Greek. And so the high priest sends 70 men-ish, 72 men, down to Egypt to do a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And the name of that was the LXX, or what we call the Septuagint. 72 Jewish elders responsible for translating it. This is where the Septuagint came from. It was very early on after Alexander and all of those events, not too long after that. Philadelphus, who was very, very kind to the Jews, he recognized, he was a learner, he was a scholar, and he recognized the wealth of history and of value to the Hebrew Old Testament. He wanted it preserved, and he wanted it in Greek. So he commissioned this Septuagint to be written, and thus the Hebrew Old Testament is put down in the language of the whole known world. And that brings us to 250 BC. Bernice of Egypt. This is another, Bernice would not be a title here, this would be a name. This would be the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, is given to Antiochus II Theos of Syria to seal an alliance. So, in order to seal an alliance, Ptolemy II Philadelphus' daughter is given to Antiochus II Theos of Syria. We see this in Daniel 11, verse 6. At the end of years, they shall join themselves together. That would be the king of the north and the king of the south, right? Egypt and Syria. They shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. That's what we just read. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. Say, wow, that's a lot going on there. What are we talking about? I'll tell you in just a moment. We see it here in 246 BC. Antiochus II, Bernice, her attendants, and her sons are killed by one of Antiochus' other jealous wives, named Laodice. And we'll get to that next thing, which is also in 246 BC in a minute. So this is how this plays out. Bernice of Egypt is also called Cleopatra. This is a title for Egyptian royalty. Her name is Cleopatra. This is not the Cleopatra from history, the Mark Antony and Cleopatra. That's like Cleopatra the 4th or something. We'll get there. Or 8th or something like that. We'll get there. That's not this Cleopatra. This Cleopatra is Bernice of Egypt, and she is, again, she's given to Antiochus. 2 years after the marriage, Antiochus' former wife, Laodice, was feeling very slighted, of course threatened, kills Antiochus, kills Bernice, kills their child, kills all of her attendants, kills everyone. Basically, she stages a coup, and then she names her son to be the new king. We read about this son in Daniel 11, verses 7 through 9. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come up with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail, and shall also carry captive into Egypt their gods, with their princes, with their precious vessels of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. So Bernice had a brother, right? Ptolemy III. Ptolemy II Philadelphus gave Bernice, his daughter, to marry Antiochus II. Antiochus is now dead. Bernice is now dead. All of her attendants, her son is now dead. And Ptolemy III is very angry that his sister was killed. Ptolemy III Euergetes. So he takes the throne, and then he invades Syria in revenge. According to Jerome, Ptolemy brought back 40,000 talents of silver, 2,500 precious vessels, and images of the Syrian gods. He easily invades Syria. He puts Laodice to death, and because the kingdom was in such transition, it was very easy to overthrow, and Ptolemy does this, and he plunders them. And we read that. That's exactly what we read, that he would enter into the fortress of the king of the north, he'd deal against them, he'd prevail, and he'd carry captive into Egypt their gods with their princes and their precious vessels of silver and gold. Jerome confirms that this indeed happened, and that all of this history happened the way Daniel tells us it would. That leads us to Daniel chapter 11, verse 10. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. So then in 219, Antiochus III the Great overflows Egypt and pushes them back all the way to the Sinai Peninsula. And for the first time, we truly see Jerusalem fall under the power of Syria. So this is now Syria. They're angry because of everything that Ptolemy III did. And Antiochus III, who's called Antiochus the Great in history, pushes down and pushes Egypt all the way back. He takes not just Jerusalem, but he takes the entire Sinai Peninsula, pushes Egypt back to its home base there. Until Antiochus III, called the Great, Egypt had maintained constant control over the region of Palestine, not the nation of Palestine. We're not going to get into geopolitics. There's no nation of Palestine, right? But the region of Palestine. That was nearly 100 years there. He would successfully push for years all the way to the Egyptian stronghold of Raphia in 217 BC, and now Syria is in control. And this is a control that they would not strongly relinquish for a number of years. Really, it would not be until Rome that this control is taken from them, and that is going to lead us into the events of Syria, and the events of Syria are very, very important biblically. The king of the north. Because this king of the north is going to lead to a king of the north who is going to be a type of that wicked man, Antichrist, and is going to establish a great deal more of Jewish history as to why it was that they switched from being just this group of people that were existing in the land to extremely fervent. Now, take note of this. Throughout this time, the entire land was what we call Hellenized, meaning that they were, the entire land was made Greek, right? Greek gods, Greek everything. The nation of Israel had, to a degree, resisted this. They still had their high priests, they still had their traditions. But recall, if we go back to Nehemiah, and we go back to Malachi, and we go back to some of those later writings, they were not just excessively fervent. The prophets were, right? Zechariah was, Haggai was, Habakkuk was, but not so much the people. the people weren't being very faithful. We even see, if Jewish tradition is accurate, Jadua's brother became a high priest of the Samaritans and worshipped in Gerizim, and there was a mixed worship system going on there. The Samaritans were doing their thing. There was not a lot of fervor at this time. And what this leads to is a slow chipping away of Jewish distinction, to where, as we'll talk about it next week, we'll see that there's a real threat that Judaism goes away entirely and that Israel becomes Hellenized and they begin to worship the Greek gods. And that is going to be, in fact, the origins of one of the primary groups of people that we find in the New Testament, the Sadducees. The Sadducees were Hellenized Jews, which is why they did not believe in a resurrection. They did not believe in an afterlife. They had a very academic view of religious thinking, a very Greek view, a very rational view of thinking, because they had sold out to Hellenistic thinking. And then as the great fervor for Jewish thought came back in, they tried to merge the two all the more. We're going to stop there for this week. Are there any final thoughts or questions on this stuff?
Thank you for listening to Pastor Jamen Wikler from Legacy Baptist Church in Buffalo, Minnesota. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.